The NHL has 4 teams on lengthy winning streaks as we hit the midway point. We'll break down some of the surprise teams, both good and bad, halfway through the season. We have our women's hockey spotlight and a busy weekend ahead, including all 32 teams in action on Saturday. All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Friday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Just download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Happy Friday, Rachel.
Happy Friday indeed.
And happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a good day. Good day.
Yeah.
It's also Claude Giroux's birthday. We love that.
There you go. Sharing a birthday with one of your favorite players can't hurt. Cannot hurt. Yep. Crazy time right now in the NHL. Hard to believe the season is already half over. And yet we have a unique situation going on right now. 4 teams on lengthy winning streaks.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I think, you can say like one of these things is not like the other, as they say. You have the Winnipeg Jets on an 8-game win streak, and they're the different team from the other 3 here, in that the other 3 are more like teams that are clawing their way back up, but the Jets have just been like quietly good all season long. On December 1st, they were in 3rd place in the Pacific, 13th overall in the NHL. Now they're top in the league, and this is how they're doing it, by consistently winning.
Yeah, they have just been quietly, consistently really, really good. And now they have more points than anybody in the National Hockey League. And yet, the other 3 teams who were on these winning streaks, the Florida Panthers, Edmonton Oilers, and Seattle Kraken, they all got off to a little bit of a shaky start, and now they've been coming on like gangbusters.
Yeah, I think, for fans of those teams, it's really great. I think, like, for fans of other teams who are maybe thinking, oh, maybe you don't have to worry about these guys this year, we might be eating those words a little bit. I would say especially so with the Edmonton Oilers, who are on a 9-game winning streak that goes back to December 21st. And they were in real trouble, and obviously, made a coaching change in this season. And I think that, with the guys they have on that roster, obviously Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, so many great players, for them to not play well was just inexplicable in a lot of ways, and par for the course in a lot of ways. And I think just making that change really helped boost them and head them in the right direction.
No question that coaching change did work as intended. And yet now you have, the Kraken, who are winners of 8 in a row. They are 8-0-2, so they have points in their last 10 games. And yet they still have a -3 goal differential, and they're even in points with Edmonton, but the Oilers have 3 games in hand.
Yeah, I think like that's going to be really interesting, because I think, of those 2 teams, which do you think can be the most consistent and keep this going and peak at the right time? I mean, you have to say the Oilers, but the Kraken are a surprising team, since they've started.
Yeah, they are ahead of schedule. Last year, making the playoffs before most experts expected them to. And then they really got off to a frustrating start, and now they're sort of climbing their way back into the playoff hunt. And when you combine the 9-game win streak by Edmonton, the 8-game win streak by Seattle, and the LA Kings now on a 7-game losing streak. It's getting a little tight in the middle of that Pacific Division.
Right. And, those two teams are only 3 points behind the Kings at this point in the season. The Oilers and Kraken next face each other on the 18th, so less than a week away. And I could not be more excited for that matchup, given
That'll
where
be
we
fun.
are.
That will be a very fun game to watch, especially if both of them still have their streaks coming in to that contest, because, that may very well sort of figure out, which team continues to trend in the right direction. And then, how about the Florida Panthers? I mean, here is a team that is now 1 point behind the Boston Bruins in the standings, which is not what a lot of people expected. They've won 9 games in a row. And we knew early in the season that they were, dealing with some injuries on the blue line. They managed to overcome this slow start, and now they are thriving.
Yeah, that's what's pretty remarkable. I think that, they've always been good, but there was this dip there where, things just were not panning out for them. And, at various points, they were still like in the number 2, number 3 slot, but at the very, very beginning, not great. And so I think it's really showing their resiliency, and I think that they are definitely going to be a force to be reckoned with as this season continues.
I agree. And again, especially after last year's big run to the Cup final, does anybody want to face them in the playoffs? I mean, wouldn't be an easy out for sure.
No, they are on the revenge tour, as they say. So.
And, while those 4 teams are red hot, let's take a little look back at a big picture situation here. Who do you feel has been some of the bigger surprises in a pleasant way this year, and maybe some of the disappointments this season?
Well, I will say my preseason pick, I will say this over and over again, for a surprise team to make the playoffs was Nashville. And so I'm pretty pleased with how they've been playing. They was a little rough at first, but they seem to have hit their stride and are winning more than they're losing overall. And I think that, they are surprising a lot of people with, they're not a top team in the league, but they're certainly a lot better than a lot of people have thought. And of course, the Vancouver Canucks. I mean, people expected them to be better this year, but not this much better.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And they are now in first place in the Pacific Division by 6 points, which is, with the loser point, it's pretty hard to make up 6 points quickly. How about a couple of other teams that I think are just exceeding expectations? Not that they're elite teams, but Montreal and Arizona.
Yeah, Arizona especially. I think there is this like group of teams where you think they're going to be in the basement or close to, and they wind up being like mid-pack teams. I think it's important to recognize that progress that they've made. In Arizona, who's had all these draft picks for all these years, have finally somehow put it together to get a bunch of really solid wins, and they're playing very well against top teams. They've had some surprising wins throughout the season. But I think that this is definitely the year that they're just taking that first big leap forward.
Yeah, and it's great to see. And Montreal just 1 game under NHL 500 at the halfway mark, where most people expected them near the bottom.
Yeah, that is absolutely true as well. Having just seen them play against the Flyers, who are another, I would say, somewhat surprising team. A lot
Yeah.
of people picked them last in the division, and they are not close to that right now. So I think, Montreal just has some really skilled, talented players on that squad, and, they're tough competition. And I think that Montreal can surprise you on any given night. They still are a little shaky in terms of which Montreal team shows up, but when they're on it, they are on it.
And then as far as disappointing teams, I look at the Atlantic Division, Buffalo and Ottawa's riding a 5-game losing streak.
Right. And again, these are kind of teams that were much lower in the standings last year that people expected to take that first leap, like the Arizona situation, right? I think a lot of people expected Buffalo and Ottawa to be able to do that to some degree. And yeah, they're just on the struggle bus. I would say Ottawa especially.
Yeah, very disappointing year in Canada's capital right now, and doesn't look like they are going to rebound anytime soon. Right now, it's a frustrating situation for the Sens. Well, we have got a lot more to discuss on today's show. Erica L. Ayala is joining us for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight, and we've got a very exciting and busy weekend ahead with all 32 teams in action on Saturday. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
It is the halfway point in the season, and regardless of where your favorite team is in the current NHL standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. You can also play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, and when they're in season, MLB and college football, and entries can be made in under a minute. All you have to do is pick whether those superstars like Connor McDavid, Sidney Crosby, or Austin Matthews, plus some of the new guys like Adam Fantilli. Unfortunately, Connor Bedard's injured, but you pick whether they will record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, or more in a given game. To win 100 times bet on Sleeper, you have to pick the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me. You can win 100 times your money playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail those picks so you can start winning big. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability.
All right, let's go to Erica L. Ayala with our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight.
Welcome to another Women's Hockey Spotlight. Erica L. Ayala here, your host of Locked On Kraken and our Locked On NHL Women's Hockey expert. We're going to talk about the PWHL. We're going to talk about some major superstars that are getting on the board and those who aren't. And we'll close out talking about the U18 tournament, maybe some surprises there as well. Let's start with the PWHL in their first week of play named their first ever 3 stars of this league, and Grace Zumwinkle from Minnesota, Alex Carpenter from the New York team, and Corrine Schroeder from New York are your 3 stars. Let's start with Schroeder. She notched the first ever shutout in PWHL history, getting a 29 save shutout over PWHL Toronto on January 1st. And Schroeder, of course, was amazing for the Boston Pride in the PHF coming out of Boston University. She also played at Quinnipiac. And actually, Corrine Schroeder will be inducted into the 2024 Women's Beanpot Tournament Hall of Fame. So congratulations to the netminder now with PWHL New York. We'll have a little bit more on the Beanpot as we get into our upcoming women's hockey spotlights. Let's now go to second star of first week of PWHL action. That was Alex Carpenter. Now, Carpenter also played for the Boston Pride several years ago at the time, the NWHL, and then, of course, played in China and with Team USA. But her 2 goals and 1 assist, 3 points overall performance in week 1 got her second star. Carpenter was the player who was able to win the puck back for PWHL New York and assist Ella Shelton, who got the first ever goal in PWHL history. And then finally, in her first pro year, in her first pro season, Grace Zumwinkle, the right winger from Minnesota, 4 goals and 2 game winners, and the first ever hat trick in PWHL history. She is the first star of week 1. Now, the season opener over for Minnesota was a win over Boston, and Zumwinkle again was able to help the Minnesota team get over Boston in a 3-1 victory. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the standings and where everyone is. But since we talked about a hat trick, let's go to the game I was able to go to on Wednesday at UBS Arena, the home of the Islanders. It was the eve before the Islanders took on the Toronto Maple Leafs. You could actually see the Maple Leafs coming in as we were getting ready for the PWHL game. This was Corrine Schroeder in net again for PWHL New York, but a very different outcome. A 5-2 win for Montreal. They're doing pretty well. We'll get into the standings in a minute. But I think not only was it surprising that Schroeder let in 5, and, I was at that game. Eye test is telling me that Schroeder had to do a lot of scrambling in front of net. So it's not the first or even the second save, but the third, fourth, fifth bite of the apple, if you will, for Montreal that was going in, which included, and one of those I should say is an empty net goal. And the third goal for Marie-Philippe Poulin and her hat trick. She gets the first ever Montreal hat trick, the second ever in PWHL history. We don't have the stars of the week. They'll be announced every Monday, but you have to think for week 2, Marie-Philippe Poulin is on the list. So let's take a look first at the standings. For those who are listening on audio, don't worry, I'll walk you through this. But it's PWHL Minnesota. Now, I talked about Grace Zumwinkle, but also Taylor Heisey, the first overall pick in the PWHL draft, kind of crushing it right now. You can see they're undefeated. They're the only undefeated team remaining in the PWHL, but they have a 3-0 record, and they have 9 goals for. So they've scored 9 in their 3 games, and they have gotten those goals by just 4 goal scorers. So Grace Zumwinkle, Taylor Heisey, you have Kendall Coyne-Schofield also got on the board for Minnesota. They've only given up 3 goals in their 3 games. So that's pretty good for PWHL Minnesota. This weekend, we'll have Ottawa at Toronto. That should be a good one. And then Boston at Montreal. And then we have some Tuesday games as well. But let's get into the standings, or the stats and the leaderboard. So I want you to take a look just who we're seeing scoring for particular teams. And we have some defenders that are scoring, including Megan Keller. Now, she's known as an offensive defender for USA Hockey, so not surprised to see that she's on the board for Boston in their 1 game, as well as Teresa Schwarbsal. She took the title for overall scoring champion, all-time scoring champion at Vermont. And so not surprised to see what she's doing in the PWHL. I want to take you over to Minnesota. Oh, yeah. You see Grace Zumwinkle up there alongside Taylor Heisey. Those 2 rookies coming in hot. They're coming in hot. Let's go. And then Denisa Kryshova, really great player for Team Czechia, as well as for the Minnesota Whitecaps in the PHF. So you'll love to see that there. I mentioned Montreal. Marie-Philippe Poulin now leading in points after being able to get that hat trick. Teresa Vanishova, who had the game-winning goal in overtime over the Minnesota Whitecaps, and her Czechia teammate, Denisa Kryshova, Vanishova got that game-winning goal for the Toronto Six in what ended up being the last ever Isabel Cup championship game. I love to see also Kennedy Marchment. Believe she's playing 3rd line minutes along with Jillian Dempsey, but this is a scorer, so make sure you're watching out for Kennedy Marchment. And so as we close out this episode of the Women's Hockey Spotlight, I want to take you over to IIHF, and I want to take a look at the standings for the U18 tournament happening right now in Switzerland, in Zurich, Switzerland. You have 4 teams that are in the medal rounds or hoping that they can get there. Canada and Team Czechia will face off, and then the US and Finland. So you might say the usual suspects when it comes to Canada, the US, and Finland, but Czechia actually took down Sweden 4-2 in the quarterfinal round to advance to the semifinals and put themselves in position to win a gold or to win a medal, period. Then Canada defeated Switzerland. That was a 6-0 win. Canada's been pretty dominant in this tournament. The United States over Germany 4-0, and Finland over Slovakia. Now, when we take a look at the stats leaders for this tournament, again, just really great play by the Canadians. You'll see that out of the top 5 goal scorers or point scorers, 3 of them are Canadian. Chloe Primerano, Abby Stonehouse, and Caitlin Kramer, all for the Maple Leaf or donning the Maple Leaf. You also have one player from Team Czechia and one player from Team Finland. So no U.S. players, at least when it comes to points overall, which is interesting. And so we know that Team Czechia on the women's side at the senior level, I've already mentioned Vanishova, and I've mentioned Vanishova. I've also mentioned Denisa Kryshova. You have Dominika Lashkova. So we're seeing that they are really showing what they can do. They've played Katerina Mrazova. Also, she's played in the CWHL. She's played in the NWHL. She's played overseas and now is playing in the PWHL. And so you're starting to see, and I love that players at the U18 tournament are being asked about the Women's Pro League, and players from Germany, players from Finland, from Czechia that are playing in this league. And at 18, they have something to aspire to and look forward to. And the great thing about the Sarah Abstriders, the Dominika Lashkovas, but particularly Denisa Kryshova, they've also played in the NCAA, which is the next step for these U18 players. So by the time we do our next women's hockey spotlight, we will have the winner of the U18 tournament and, of course, more PWHL updates. But as always, make sure you follow me. You can follow at Black Rosie Media or listen to the Locked On Kraken podcast.
Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. This is scary. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if one of my loved ones got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from getting the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, we'll be okay because of Jase Medical. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, skin infections, and others. And this is stuff that could happen to any of us. Visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician. Your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. So go to jasemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Rachel, we have a busy schedule this weekend, and it is very, very Saturday heavy with all 32 teams playing with only a couple of games on Friday and Sunday. But let's start with the 2 games on Friday. Nashville and Dallas, kind of a big Central Division matchup, gets us started tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, obviously Dallas has been tremendous. We just talked about Nashville and how they're surprising a lot of people with some of their success. Dallas just absolutely destroyed I believe the Minnesota Wild in back-to-back games. So they're not back-to-back, but home and home games. So I think they've been on a roll recently, and I think that this is going to be a good test for Nashville.
And then your Philadelphia Flyers are in Minnesota to take on the aforementioned Wild, and Minnesota's struggling a bit lately.
Yeah, they've had some mixed results. Of course, they are missing a couple of key players, and Kaprizov, Jared Spurgeon's also out. And so I think that, this is going to be a good game for the Flyers, I think, especially getting back out on the road to see if they can keep this going.
Should be interesting to see. Meanwhile, Saturday, everybody is playing. And
You get a game, and you get a game, and you get a game.
And it all starts with the Rangers and Capitals in a Metropolitan Division battle at 1:00 Eastern time. And boy, the standings in the Metro are tight right now.
I know, it is ridiculous. Part of me loves it because with everything being close, anything can happen, but also with everything being close, anything can happen. So I think that, and the Rangers have come down to earth a little bit as, in the last couple of weeks. And so this should be a fun division rivalry game.
How about Vancouver and Buffalo? The Canucks keep on winning. The Sabres kind of struggling, but it's been a pretty good East Coast trip for the Canucks.
Yeah, they tend to do that when they come east, and so yeah, I think it should be a really good game. But I do see the Canucks coming out on top on this one.
The New Jersey Devils in Florida to take on the Red Hot Panthers. Can the Devils get more consistent goaltending?
Yeah, I think that's the big question for them, right? And I think that they have so many good pieces there, and they're I think eking out a lot of extra points here and there that maybe they shouldn't be getting lucky, but goaltending is the big question here.
Pittsburgh and Carolina, another one of those Metropolitan Division matchups that has a big effect on the standings.
Yeah, and again, with the standings being the way that they are right now in the Metro, you could lose 2 games and drop 4 or 5 spots in the standings, or gain 4 or 5 spots. And Carolina has just been on a roll as of late. And I think that, with the Penguins trying to climb back into it, this should be a really good matchup.
The Edmonton Oilers put their winning streak on the line in La Belle Province as they take on the Canadiens. Can Montreal end this streak?
I don't know, man. I think that's a tall order. But, if the right version of the Montreal Canadiens shows up, then sure.
Colorado in Toronto. This should be a very big game between two very talented teams.
Yeah, and with Colorado trying to keep up with Winnipeg, every win counts for them. I think, similarly in the Atlantic Division, the Leafs are trying to get back into it with those top 2 teams of Boston and Florida. We didn't even talk about Boston, who's annoyingly still really good. And I will continue to say it that way. But I think that Toronto wants to be part of that conversation and needs to be part of that conversation at the top of the division. So they do have a couple games in hand on those top 2 teams, but this would be a great way to establish themselves as leaders.
And your Flyers going up against the red hot Winnipeg Jets.
Yeah.
And for the Flyers, it's a back-to-back.
I know. It's going to be a rough one in Winnipeg. It'll be tough to get there because there's no airport, as we know. But I think that, I don't know. It's going to be a tough one for the Flyers.
The Boston Bruins, who you mentioned, in St. Louis to take on the Blues, and the Blues are hanging around.
Yeah, they are one of the most confounding teams to me this season, where you see them do good stuff, but then I think they've got the worst power play in the NHL right now, and they just can't seem to get it together consistently, and I think that's been their problem.
And then the late game, the Calgary Flames in Vegas to take on the Golden Knights.
Yeah, that should be a fun one. Calgary, again, I think, they're on the precipice of getting ready to sell big at trade deadline. But they've got to have these guys in the best way possible so they can sell high. And so having some degree of success is important for them.
Absolutely. Only 2 games on tap on Sunday. One of them, another one of those big Metropolitan Division matchups. Washington at Madison Square Garden to take on the Rangers.
Yeah, I love that back-to-back home and home situation that those two have got going. That game at MSG, I predict some fisticuffs and some physicality going down.
And then an original 6 matchup to close out the weekend, Detroit in Toronto.
Yeah, again, it's really about Toronto here. I think, Detroit had a really good start to the season, but they've kind of leveled out to where they really should be at this point, given where they are with their rebuild. But Toronto's just got to rack up wins at this point.
Yeah, they're in a challenging situation for sure in the Atlantic. Well, that is the weekend ahead. I want to thank Erica Ayala for joining us for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I will be back on Monday interviewing 3 of our local hosts about the biggest stories from around the NHL. Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.